You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for the top wines and spirits in the world at vintmarketplace.com. As always, I'm joined by Billy Galanko, who is about to jet set off, but getting in a little recording session here. Good to see you, Billy.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be back with everybody. Yeah, I'll be heading out this week, so when you're listening to this episode, I'll be in France, going to Burgundy this week, and I'll be in Bordeaux next week.
Nice. Living the dream, doing some Master of Wine work, and a little bit of just sightseeing and exploration too, or are you going to be booked up the whole time?
Booked up most during the week. I'll have a little bit on the weekend, but I'm filling that up with tastings and hoping to be pruning a vineyard with a special someone we've had on the program, a past guest. I'll share that if it actually happens. I don't want to get everybody's hopes up, and if it doesn't happen.
Hey, or get your hopes up, or my hopes up. Yeah, we're all in this together. I want to see Billy in the vineyards more often.
Yeah, for sure. Unfortunately, it might be raining, but you know what? The vines don't wait. I will learn about that.
Nice. Well, we have a great guest today, Peter Sisseck from Pingus. Folks will know him. Also has a chateau in Saint Emilion, which we talk about a little bit. Yeah, great guest who's pushing a lot of boundaries. And I read a quote talking about how he says, most boring thing about winemaking is that so many experts can only talk about wine. They should also be able to talk about everything, art, music, literature. He's definitely that kind of Renaissance type figure and trying to be progressive in the wine industry.
Yeah. No, I'm really excited to have him on. I think it's obviously one of the icons of the Spanish wine world. Certainly one of the most expensive wines in all of Spain, and he really burst onto that scene with the first vintage in '95. I agree with him on the being a well-rounded person coming from an art background, but what I did like about talking to him is he's very much into the science and nuance of especially work in the vineyards, nuance in the winery. So he's certainly not one of these, sometimes you get some of these people who are big personalities and they lead their winery, but they're rarely in the winery or in the vineyard. They're just out there hosting dinners and doing things, but he clearly knows the ins and outs, and he's trying to make his wine better and every day and save old vines just through good work and the viticulture and in vinification. So it was a really enlightening conversation. I was taking notes left and right, just learning.
Yeah, and bringing a spotlight to Spanish wines outside of Rioja, right up there in the Ribera del Duero, and talking a lot about the way that they've been able to push forward, like just quality viticultural practices up there across the different properties that they source fruit from. And really elevated that region. So cool conversation. But before we get into that, do we have any news for this week or things to take a look at?
Yeah, the highlight from the Vint Weekly Wine News, or the Vint Wine Weekly Wine News. Hold on, I'm going to say the highlight from the Vint Marketplace Weekly Wine News is an article I actually pulled from VinePair. So again, for everybody who, just a quick recap, what the Vint Weekly Wine News is that I go through and source 5 of the articles that I think would be most interesting from the wine world for that week. So this was one of them, and it was the most underrated wines for 2025, according to 20 Wine Pros, posted on VinePair. And they have a range of different selections, ranging from very specific wines to varieties and general regions. So I thought it was fascinating and shared with Brady. So we're going to go through a couple of the ones that we either agree with or disagree with and share our thoughts.
Yeah, this is an interesting list. And so basically it's a list of 20 comments from 20 different wine professionals, basically giving their either style of wine, grape variety, region, or like very specific label even, actually, depending on what people decide to choose. And then a little write-up on why they said it was the case. And so I'm just going to said that I would pull one that seemed like it was weird and one that I think is probably spot on. I mean, obviously there are almost no wrong answers, but some of them seem wrong. This one seemed wrong to me, and it was that Merlot was just on the list as Merlot being underrated. Not sure how one of the foundational varieties for Bordeaux wines, which are highly coveted and make up a massive segment of the market, could be that underrated. I understand the sort of deflated perception around Merlot and people, boring, doesn't stand as, people think that it doesn't stand on its own as much, but certainly some of the best wines in the world are majority Merlot or make their foundation in Merlot. I thought that was an interesting, weirdish one.
Yeah. I will say, to play devil's advocate or to counter that point, is I personally do Merlots a lot, and I do think they make amazing wines. And to your point, they're in a lot of fantastic blends, but in New World blends too. But if you go to the grocery store and you look for a variety or a varietally named wine, you'd be harder pressed to find a large number of Merlot based, just straight up Merlot. I did it just the other day, and there's so many Cabernet Sauvignon, there's so many Pinot Noir. But if you go and just try to find Merlot, I think people just, with that perception, and it might be a self-fulfilling prophecy, they're really putting some of their best Merlot in some of these quote-unquote blends, or they'll call it a Bordeaux blend if it's heavily Merlot, and with the thinking that that's what the consumer wants. And I think it's largely true. Hopefully it'll change.
Yeah, and if you find a bottle, I don't know, who knows if this is true, even the majority of the time, but my perception is that if you pick up a bottle that says red blend on the front, and it's like US, you might see something like it's a blend of, it's got Merlot in it, or it's dominated in something like Zinfandel. Just like varieties, maybe they're a little bit cheaper to cultivate and put into those wines if we're talking about grocery store type wines, and whether or not that makes up underrated or overrated. Yeah, probably in the cultural mind, I can see that Merlot is a little bit underrated, but I think in the depths of the wine world, not as much. But beyond that, I think the one that was probably spot on was, the specific Cremant de Jura, so Cremant from the Jura Valley. And I was just going to say Cremant generally, especially the price of champagne these days. And obviously you can still find great value champagne, and even from some of the top producers, there's still some really great options that you can come in at, but hard to beat the value of Cremant from basically any region, especially Jura Valley or Bourgogne, Burgundy generally. But yeah, really great options across the board, and typically, multiples below the price you're going to pay for even average or entry level champagne in some cases.
Yeah, I agree across the board. So for everybody who may not know, a Cremant de anything is basically the designation in France for a sparkling wine that's made in the traditional method, but it's not made in champagne. So I agree with you in the fact that anything that goes through secondary fermentation in the bottle is there's a lot of work that goes into making that. So I think that's super, super on point. I've had some great Cremants from all over. I just had a Cremant from Alsace this weekend. Very nice. So I completely agree. Plus they're growing up in the Jura and those mountains. There's a lot of high altitude, cooler climates. So they're really nice acid in the grapes. Both the local varieties, and they're also growing, Chardonnay up there as well. That's really cool. So definitely a good place for Cremant.
Yeah, what'd you have on your side?
The first one I had, after reading through, I didn't really look that interesting at first, but then when I clicked in or read through what they were recommending, was the New York Reds section. And in my head, we talked about Cab Franc from Long Island, didn't we? Yeah, and that's what the only thing I thought they were going to talk about. But what was interesting to me is they first called out a Malbec from Long Island, from the North Fork, which I didn't really know they grew Malbec up there. And they also compared it more to a Cahors example, like where Malbec's originally from in France, as opposed to an Argentinian example or an Argentine example. So I thought that was really neat. They talked about some Gamay from the Hudson Valley, which is just north of New York City, which I hadn't really considered. And they also threw out a Cab Franc, as well as some Pinot Noir from the Niagara area. So really kind of I like that they took a broader look and informed us about some cool examples of these red grapes that don't typically pop to mind when you think of New York.
Yeah, maybe it's just because I live south of New York, but I just have this perception of getting once you get above New York City, just like cooler climate. And so seeing which it is obviously, but seeing some of these varieties like Cab Franc and Pinot Noir, like Gamay, feeling like probably you're getting some pretty interesting, like really bright, ripe, brambly, like crunchy wines, fruit wise out of those, which, yeah, really interesting to me because when I get up into that area, I start to think of the like hybrid varieties that we've discussed, like when we talk about Vermont and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so to hear Pinot Noir, Cab Franc in these conversations, it makes me intrigued to try some more of those wines.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think the other one, I didn't really have one necessarily that I was offended with. I do think it's funny that also the blending grape with Merlot, Cab Franc is on here, but that one does stand alone and is getting more popular, actually, especially coming from like the Loire and stuff. But I think the other one that I agree with more, and it's on here in two different forms, is Carignan and Carignan-based red blends. I think that there's some acidity and some brightness to Carignan and what it brings to blends, both in the south of France, northern part of Spain, but also here in California. There's actually a lot of really old vine Carignan in Northern California, and like at least here in LA, we can get bottles of old vine Carignan they're really cheap, like under $20. Or if you go to a wine bar, sometimes they'll be serving them for under $15 a glass, which out here in LA is cheap. And these are like 100-year-old vines. So it's and mainly because they're grown in these kind of hotter, dustier climates, they're able to live for these long times because there's less disease risk and all of that. But some of those are some of the most criminally underrated, I think, in my mind, just because of how long some of these vines have existed and the interesting balance and acid that it brings.
Well, also on this list is I'm saying it properly, right? Uco Valley, like Mendoza, which obviously a ton of Malbec up there, but also Carignan as well. So Carignan presents itself a few other times on the list.
Yeah, it's on here 3 times maybe. So that is something to look out for. It's not one you'll typically see as like the leader on the label always, or as a single variety always, but definitely something if you hear it's in there, it's probably a cool one.
And again, are some really old vines too, especially down there in South America in the Carignan. So it's cool.
But yeah, so I think on the Carignan's actually from Spain, Carignana. There's actually a region called Carignana just kind of east of Rioja, and that's where it came from. And then it moved up into France, and that's the French name is Carignan. But going back to Spain, yeah, really excited to get to our interview with Peter. I don't think everybody knows how much he really does in the wine world. So he has Pingus, which is obviously one of the most famous wines in the world. Then he has Flor de Pingus, which is what he calls a village wine, representing more of their general holdings and some fruit they buy in Ribera del Duero. And then they have Sai, which is the project, or PSI. I just call it Sai in my head. Where they're working with old vines, basically trying to buy up as much plots as they can, or buying fruit from old vines where they can, and really preserving those old vines in the area. So I thought that was really cool. But then we also dive into his work in Bordeaux with his Chateau Rocheron. I'm not saying that great. Maybe when I come back from Bordeaux, I'll have a better accent. And then what I also thought was really interesting, because I'm a sherry person, was his work in sherry with Viña Corrales, where he's working, trying to create some single site sherries and like the biologically aged, like the Fino method. So I thought that was really cool, and it was cool to get the details about what they're doing in the vineyards and the winery. We really got down into the weeds with him.
Yeah, I appreciate his long vision for their region and the fact that he's making wines at a couple different price points from different vineyards all around the area. And I think elevating growers, doing a service to the culture of viticulture there, right? Just to raise the bar for how people treat these vines, which a lot of them have a lot of history, like you said, old vineyards, and they were just getting ripped out. And so doing a lot of good work there. And just like you said, someone who's been around and has his hands in a lot of things in the wine world, and his family has for a little bit of time as well. And the conversation we had with him, he was actually down in Saint Emilion, I believe, at their chateau that week recording. So he gets around, and they're making some excellent wines across the board. It was great to have Peter on. Before we get to that interview, remember, check out our online wine and spirits store at vintmarketplace.com. You can find Pingus, PSI, Flor de Pingus, and I'm not sure if we have the Saint Emilion wine available as well, but a lot of the wines we've talked about, and certainly tons of Merlot and Carignan. But you can find all of the cult classics, Bordeaux, Barolo, as well as niche producers and the wines from your favorite somms. With one of the largest selections of inventory in the U.S. and some of the most competitive pricing for enthusiasts and collectors, the Vint Marketplace is your go-to shop for stocking your wine cellar. And so now here's our interview with Peter Sisseck, founder, winemaker, and wine world extraordinaire. Hey, Peter, thanks so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
We're lucky to have a lot of really amazing winemakers, critics, writers, all kinds of folks on the podcast, and you're certainly and your family right up there on the list. And so I appreciate you taking the time. Excited to hear more about all of your different projects and about your family history.
It's wonderful being here. Thank you.
Why don't you, just for our listeners maybe who aren't as familiar, give us just a really brief background and then leading up to your first vintage at Pingus in 1995 and the lay of the land.
Yeah, well, my family made wine in Bordeaux, and I came into contact with that when I was quite young. And then I did what we in Europe called a stage. So I did training period with my uncle when I was 20. From there, I decided to do agriculture, not just viticulture, but agriculture. But I did that in Denmark. But I kept contact through my uncle, but also I was in the States working. And so basically, during my university, I was traveling a lot. I was making wine all over the world and didn't go to many lectures in Copenhagen, but I did get my exam, so whatever. But that's important. And then in 1990, I was able to go to Spain for a while. I was actually on my way to California, but I had a couple of months in between jobs. And I just stayed in Spain. So that's basically how everything started. I was able to start a project that is still running the most classic wine in Ribera today. That's called Hacienda Monasterio. As it wasn't my own property, I decided in 1995 to start my own stuff. That became Pingus. That's what I'm doing today.
You're on your way to a ridge that you were supposed to go to, and you decided.
Absolutely. Yeah. I met Paul Drake in '89, and he was kind enough to offer me a job at Ridge Winery. But I'm sorry I never made it over there. Before that, I'd worked at Simi Winery with Sel Ballon in '85. I had tremendous relationship with a lot of great guys in California and the wine industry over there. And I still love that place, but I never really made it professionally to go there. Even though I had a couple of offers to go there, but I never really got it together. And all this stuff I'm doing in Europe now doesn't allow me too much time to go to California, but I love to visit. It's a great place, great people.
Are those wines, like in the Ridge journey, something that you've really continued to closely follow? And there's a style of wines here in the U.S. that you enjoy?
Yeah, I like some of these, what you could call the old style California wines, Stony Hill and Ridge and some of the old. I was able to taste some great wines from the 40s and some of that stuff I really appreciate. And I think there was a moment in time where all went a bit over the hill in ripeness and stuff. That when you taste some of the Inglenook's and stuff like that. I'm born in '62, so a couple of years ago I had a great opportunity to taste a lot of Inglenook's from the '60s, and they were just amazing wines and interestingly pretty low in alcohol. We have a wonderful lab at Pingus Winery, and we were able to analyze all these wines, and they were often under 13 alcohol. And they were just beautiful wines, just amazing wines. Of course, they were made, I'm sure they were picked at low alcohol, and the vinification and the aging was able to smooth out whatever perhaps rougher tannins or more green tannins, and just made it into something really, really appreciable. I was also lucky enough to taste, when I was working at Simi Winery, to taste some wines from the 30s, from Simi Winery, wonderful Cabernets from the 30s. Just amazing wines, just really, really great stuff. I think maybe that was lost for a while. I think a lot of it's coming back. I think some of the younger winemakers in California now is trying to change a bit some of these overripeness stuff. I don't think anybody really likes that style.
I agree. Well, moving back to to Spain here, I think some people have referred to Ribera del Duero as the newer world of Spain or a newer region compared maybe to Rioja. How would we actually just had an episode on Rioja not too long ago? Can you explain a little bit for our listeners, like a little just 101 on the differences and what makes your wines distinctly unique, or at least the regions?
Yeah. First of all, Rioja had the traditional great red wine area in Spain. They've been making wine since the late 1900s in a specific style that is directly born off the phylloxera in France. So a lot of French people came down when their vineyards died. It was earlier, the phylloxera in France than it was in Spain. So they found a sort of an area in Spain where they could still produce wines. And so that helped a lot. But also introduced new techniques, barrel aging and stuff like that, that wasn't common in those days in Spain. So they started barrel aging much earlier than we did in Ribera. Ribera was very rustic. 1865, Vega Sicilia is planted. That is our great wine, historic wine in Ribera del Duero. But it wasn't until 1915 that they started making commercial wine and barrel aged wine, basically. So that tradition is, and then still between 1915 and the early 80s, where Ribera del Duero is discovered, you can say that, by Bob Parker through Tito Pesquera, and a whole lot of investment starts happening. I'm one of those guys who came after that moment. But it was pretty evident that a lot of people were maybe not so used to wine at all, apart from just very local, pretty rustic, a lot of character, but not very high in finesse and refinement. And I think probably the job that I've been contributing to since the early 90s was to give it a bit more, let's call it a French approach, and more finesse driven in a way, and to focus a lot of the vineyards on the vineyards. Most people in the early days, in late 80s, 90s, they would just buy grapes. They didn't really know who grew them, and the people who grew them, they had been growing the grapes in a certain way for the last 200, 300 years. So there wasn't a lot of technique and a lot of stuff that you can do. Also, there was a moment where trellising the vineyard started happening. So there was a lot of T-bars, trellising that was hopeless. People started irrigating without really knowing what they were doing. So there were a lot of errors done in those early moments, and probably also led to the idea that Ribera was a more modern area in Spain. Again, I think there was a moment because the style is easily transmitted into something bold and too much. That happened many places in the world. We just talked about California, also happened in the 90s in California. So Ribera was part of that trend where Rioja, being bigger wineries, they were slower to react to it, and they're probably now in that league, trying to make a bit more bigger wines and stuff. Yeah, so there's a big difference between Rioja but I think it's down to the size of the cellars and the professionalism of the operations that Rioja just seems more mature than we are, basically. So we are more experimental in Ribera.
Would you say, when you talk about maybe being a little bit, and I'm not going to use the word immature, but like you said, a little bit more experimental, what are some ways that specifically has been an advantage for you in that, you specifically in your operation in that region, as opposed to, for instance, if you had a legacy estate in Rioja, like you said, that maybe is slow to react to things, less nimble. Yeah. What are specific things you guys have done?
Yeah. And I would say that for me, being very experimental from myself, I would probably not have done it so different, but it's true that having a very definitive style or traditional in Rioja would have been more controversial in a way if I had started to doing something very different in Rioja than it was in Ribera. The style was not so defined in Ribera, so it didn't seem such a crazy thing in a way. But it did have a big impact on a lot of people and what we were doing.
I wanted to touch on how you identified your specific vineyard site, Low Oro, that you use, and also you're a self-described specialist in limestone. How did those two kind of confluences come together to identify the specific site?
I mean, I never chose on purpose Ribera. So it was something that happened to me. I was then on this mission to go there and look after vineyard for a while. And then when I was supposed to go on to California. So when I arrived there in the early days, I'd never really pretend I was going to stay there. So if a love that grew on me in a way, no, it didn't happen. It was not flash in the pan thing, just whoa, this is the most amazing place I ever met in my life. That was a lot of doubts in the beginning. And I would probably say now, 25, 30 years later, I begin to really appreciate all the stuff and the talent that our vineyards have. But it's been growing on me, you can say that, for sure.
Interesting. Well, you've been proposing a Bordeaux classification system in Ribera. How would that work? Just basically
it wouldn't really be like in Bordeaux, because Bordeaux is very different. And I wouldn't recommend that to Ribera. What I would recommend is what my great friend Alvaro Palacios has conceived in Priorat, and also with his cousin's place in Bierzo, which is northwest of where we are. It's basically a system that's very simple. So you have specific vineyards, and they can be then, if they have a legacy or a history or 10 or 15 years of legacy, they could be classified as specific classified vineyards. So if not, it's just a specific vineyard. And then you would have the next level would be area wines that the French would call lieu-dit wines. So it comes within a specific area within a village. Then the next level would be village wines. And then in the biggest level would be regional wines. So I think that's a very, almost like a Burgundian approach to it, without the classification in Grand Cru and Premier Grand Cru. But it would be lieu-dit vineyard, lieu-dit village, and regional wine. I think that would be very sensible. I think it would help us tremendously in our communication. Right now, all the Ribera wines are just classified as Ribera. As a regional wine, we're not allowed to do any specification whatsoever. It's difficult to explain in a good way that 120 kilometers long of vineyard of vineyard area is all the same. It defies the logic of it. No, but this is where we are right now. And as it's not possible, we can just only do what we're doing, and we try to. Pingus is our cru, it's our vineyard, specific vineyard. Florida Pingus is our village wine, and PSI is our regional wine. So that's how we work right now.
I think I read somewhere about the way that you approach your PSI wine, and obviously it's regional wine. I assume you buy a fair amount of fruit for that wine.
That whole project was based on the fact that we were buying fruit because we wanted to help to save the vines, the old vines, the old biodiversity that we had. So the whole idea was that we were going to buy the grapes because that was the only logical way I could see that we could get a certain volume. And at the same time, so we work right now around 200 hectares from 700 plots and 500 vineyards, vineyard growers. So it's a pretty crazy project. Is that okay? Yeah.
I think you wanted to save the vines, right? But
and it's true. It wasn't just a fancy word. It really was. In 2006, I could see that more and more of the old vines were being pulled out and replaced by nondescript bullshit clonal vineyard. And I thought that was a pity because what had created the fame of Ribera del Duero for the last 30 years, at least in my time, was the old vineyards. And they were just being pulled out. Nobody was caring about them. And it's true that they need a lot of care, a lot of help. And I've been realizing in the last couple of years that the reality of it is that most people do not hold on to the old vines just because they are romantic or because they love them, but basically because they're too old. And being too old also means that they're too old to work the vineyard. So often there are vineyards that have great potential are not worked in the proper way. And so we have to do something about it. And we started a program where we buy the vineyards now. So we've been buying almost 50 hectares in the last 2 years. And hopefully we can reach maybe half of what we need for our production. We will be able to own ourselves, because the quality is really pretty amazing, the difference of. And I would say that it's not to say that the people are not very great viticulturists. It's just that they just have a different approach. They don't have the same attention to detail as you would. And I can just see we can really improve the quality of PSI tremendously just through doing the right proper work in the vineyard. So that's, for the next 10, 15 years, is going to be a big part of how we're going to change that wine.
And adjacently, it serves not just to make your PSI wine better, but also to elevate the winemaking of the region generally.
Yes.
I just wanted to call out that project has served winemaking, viticulture in the region really well, not just the growth of your project.
That's my hope. It's the famous analogy of throwing a stone into the water, no, and just see how it spreads by rings. Is what I hope. The reality is also sometimes a bit more frustrating. It's not always I see that people they get too inspired by what we're doing, but hopefully with time they can see that what we're doing is not totally crazy. Right now, most people just think I'm playing crazy, but that's okay. And I'm pretty happy with what we're doing. Yeah.
And part of that is because you guys do practice biodynamics, but also you've been employing some new pruning techniques. I think they're maybe during the growing season as opposed. Can you talk a little bit about those and the impacts?
Absolutely. That was one of the great learning curves that we've had. When people talk about climate change and now everything is going to change and we have to plant new varieties and we have to start irrigating and everything like that. To me, the inspiration is how can we continue doing what we are doing just in a better way? That's I cannot see we should start growing crazy varieties and like they have proposed in Bordeaux, no? That they should start using Terroir and National and all kinds of crazy grapes. Why should they do that? You just have to change things. And one of the things I always like what La Loubice Leroy in Burgundy was doing. And when she started talking about that, no, you shouldn't cut the vines, top them off in summer. And you should try it, and then they will grow and you can roll them and all kinds of stuff. And that sounded pretty romantic and whatever, until I tried it myself and realized that the vineyards that we didn't top didn't show any signs of water stress. Where the vineyards next door that had been topped, they showed sometimes stress on the basal leaves. So I started thinking about what's the difference now. And of course, basically, when you cut off the apex, you provoke a reaction in the vines where they start producing side shoots, and sometimes in a sort of almost uncontrolled, stupid way. So you often end up with more leaf surface, basically, and then in order not to shadow the grapes or whatever too much, then you would pick up some of the side shoots. And again, that would provoke also the plant again to stress again. So it's just like one ongoing stressful experience for the vineyard. If you don't do anything, the vineyard will be able to grow more or less according to how much water it has available. And we end up with vineyards that are just much more, they look great. I hate this, but that's because sound of it, that they look happy, no? It's a stupid thing. But there's an air of them that they seem to have a cool thing going, no? So but in order to do that, we needed to put them on poles, which is a tremendous work. We just had bush vines before, but in order, and we had planted, it all started with densely planted vineyards, 6,000 vines per hectare, where it was difficult to get a tractor or even a horse in between the rows. So we needed to put them on poles. And so we put them on poles and then we cut them so it looked nice and all that was very beautiful. But they stressed the vineyards too much. And so let's try this new thing. But so the whole thing is that we need to put them on poles, which is a tremendous work. So in the beginning, it was just on the densely planted young vines that we've been developing for the last 10, 15 years. And now this winter, we just put all the vineyards of Pingus, the 4 hectares of Pingus, very old vineyard planted in 1929, bush vines, very, really big guys. So we put them on poles as well. But in order to put them on poles, sometimes you have to put 2 or 3 poles for each vine. So it's a big work. And so 25 will be the first vintage where we will have uncut Pingus. So that is going to be tremendously exciting to see how that will cope and if it's going to change the aspect of the grapes of Pingus.
Very cool. So you just have the poles, and then you allow the vines just to keep growing straight up, or are they flopping over?
Yeah, no, we tie them. We tie them, and then so they don't fall over. So we tie them, and then we don't touch them. And sometimes if they continue growing and they start bend over, we will roll them together so they stay together and support me. Yeah. So it's still a technique that we're developing. But I was just meeting a guy around in Burgundy. They've been working in the same way for some time now also, and more. The Châtelet Chaud is also doing the same in Burgundy. So a lot of people are going that way. Very interesting. Very interesting. Let's see how far we can push it. I would love to do it also with PSI, but again, it's a pretty expensive technique. So let's see how we can make it more manageable, because it takes a lot of handwork to do it.
Do any of this might be an off question, but do any of your PSI, any of the fruit from the projects that typically go into PSI, can they, for lack of a better word, graduate up into the other wines, or are they only there on your property for pink?
Yeah, no, we keep it separate. But there are some of the vineyards that we have realized that has tremendous potential, that for the moment is going into the PSI, but that we are experimenting on the side to see how far we can push them out. How far is the challenge? We have just had a very interesting tasting where we vinified a lot of Grenache in a new way that shows tremendous potential. So that's pretty possible that we will do a separate cuvée of that. We're also looking into white grapes, Bio, which is a local white grape that has almost Chardonnay-ish affinity with wood that on itself is not very interesting. But it has, I normally hate people who, in order to make an ambitious white wine, they need to put it into wood. But this one has really surprised me. It really improves dramatically, and it just seems to have a really nice profile. So we're also looking into that. So I'm pretty sure that in 5-10 years, we will have a lot of PSI siblings, or whatever you like to call them. It's a project that I find tremendously interesting. And we are able to work with these very, very old vineyards. And we are in 5 or 6 different villages. So that's also, it's spread out. So there's a lot of potentiality. So it's a hotbed of interest. Yeah.
Excellent. What is the Garnacha vinification technique that you found to work well?
Really long maceration.
Like pre and post?
Yeah, almost 3 months, something like that. Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah, like Buolotto is doing. Buolotto, a Barolo guy, for his top cuvées, he's doing very, very long maceration.
Yep.
Very, very interesting. Really, really interesting. So let's see how far we can push it. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, that's fascinating. Speaking of just vinification over the years, last question here, then we'll actually move on. And I want to talk about your Jerez and Bordeaux wines as well. Yeah. But for Pingus, you've moved away from a lot of new oak, I guess, as everyone kind of has in the world.
Yeah.
Are you continuing to use other vessels as well, or is it just continue to use wood but less new?
Yeah. So again, the oak thing is always controversial now in a way, because there was an abuse of oak for a moment, I think, in history. But again, it was back in time where ripeness was not so much an issue as it is today because of the warming. So when I taste back in history of the last 25 years I've been making wine, when I taste some of the earlier wines, I just had a wonderful 2003, and that was aged in 100% new wood, and it was perfect. Then there were no traces of excess of anything, even though it was not as warm as it was in France. 2003 is a very controversial vintage in France. But I guess because we are up in 900 meters, I don't remember 2003 as excessively warm and hot. It was just wonderful ripeness, but it was still classic ripeness. It was 13.5, 14 degrees alcohol. It wasn't crazy. The real problem is once you have high alcohol, the extraction capacity of alcohol on new oak just makes it sometimes too much. So if you have a wine that's 15.5 and you put in 100% new oak, it's going to be at first vintage. I was a bit perplexed about what was going on. It was 2005. That was more ripe than we had experienced before. I call it precursor vintage in a way for the warming. And we decided from 2006 on to change our oak regime. And we started from 2006, it was, and until 12, it was half new oak, 50%. And from 12 on, we are down to no new oak for Pingus, 25% new oak for floor. And for PSI, we don't use any new oak at all. Just the big wooden tanks and 20% smaller barrels. So that's what we're doing. I have recently, this vintage being the first, discovered a tank made in Italy that is made in a porcelain clayish thing. It's not an amphora, and it's made with extreme care, so you can have a very precise level of oxygen penetration, of porosity, and it's easy to clean. It's called tape. Really interesting stuff. And the first fermentation that we're doing, it's really like barrel, but with no flavors, of course. So we have 3 of those, 850 liters. That seems very, very promising. So I'm not really sure to what degree we're going to use it in the future, but I'm pretty sure that we're going to use part of that for stuff that probably some of the more experimental stuff that we're going to do, small cuvées that we're going to do in PSI could be a possibility. But let's see. We're also using at Fjord Pingus, we are now using 2,000 liter tanks, as we are here in France as well. We have 1,200 liter tanks for our Cabernet Franc. That doesn't seem to oak too much, barrel oak, but it really likes the bigger tanks. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening on that part. It's also true that the quality from the barrel makers oak tanks are much higher now than it used to be. It used to be really, really mean and tannic and not very high quality. But there's a lot of work from their side also, so it's much more interesting now.
Very cool. I'm going to have to read more about those. Just the Claver.
Claver. Yeah, Claver they're called. Yeah.
Cool. Very neat. All right. Well, you mentioned Bordeaux. Let's talk about a couple of your other projects. I wanted to go to Jerez before we go to Bordeaux, just because
we can do that.
I'm a sucker for sherry. Can you talk a little bit about Vineyard and your project there?
Yeah. Again, having visited, of course, sherry and Jerez is the most classic wine area of Spain and probably the most original. You can say that Rioja is an imitation of any French, especially from Bordeaux region. Barrel aging, the philosophy was very Bordelais in its approach, no? To be really tough, an imitation of that. But sherry is totally unique. It's just totally its own stuff, no? We have these amazing limestone soils that have a tremendous water retaining capacity, and being very white, they also reflect a lot of the light, so the soil doesn't heat too much. So even though that we're only 40 kilometers from Africa and one of the hottest regions, you are able to mature grapes to a high degree of finesse. If you then add to that some very interesting cellar ways of doing stuff, especially with the biological aged wines, manzanillas and finos. I think you have something that's really unique in the world. It's not the only place in the world where you do biological aging. You have a bit of tradition for that in Hungary and in Jura also, of course, in France. But that's under cold climate, very different. And the process is slightly different from what we do in Jerez. Also, the proximity to the sea, all that also does add to it. So you have this coming to Jerez many years ago, I was puzzled by the fact that they didn't talk about vineyard origin. No? I've always been a sucker for vineyards and sites and stuff like that. No, and the approach was that the process was so transformative for the wine that it didn't really matter where the wine came from. And I thought that was a neat way of making 10 million bottles of nondescript bullshit wine, no, like they did in Burgundy, not Burgundy, in Champagne for a moment, no, where the whole idea was that the whole transformative thing of Champenoise method would transform the wine so profoundly that it didn't really matter where it came from. No, I think, especially since still us, most people are realizing that, of course, that is not true at all. And so I was keen to try to demonstrate the same in Jerez. So in 2017, I bought 2 vineyards, one in Machanudo and one in Bilbaína, which is the classic Fino or the grape area, and Machanudo, which is the Domecq vineyard that was famous for making Fino Montiados. That sort of, and the idea is to prove that directly and indirectly, the vineyard has a lot of influence on the process of the biological aging. We only make biological aged wines. I have no interest whatsoever in making wines of Montiado or Oloroso. That for me are basically wines that are made from errors of the Fino production. I know all my colleagues in Jerez are not necessarily on that page with me, but I think it's tremendously interesting what you can achieve through that. The big issue right now is that even though that we are so close to equator, you can say, the Palomino doesn't ripe so well, and there's a tradition for adding alcohol to the wine that for the moment is a bit of a thing. There do exist ways of drying the grapes under the sun, but we've been doing experiments with that, and I don't really like, because I think that the wines, they become flat and are oxidized in a way I don't like them so much. But I don't think it's a really good technique for that. If you really wanted to, we're not allowed to, but if you really wanted to not add alcohol, you could remove water. Then we have good techniques for doing that, osmosis and stuff like that. If that really was what you wanted to do, or you could try to say this is an interesting technique of adding alcohol, and then make sure that the alcohol that you add is alcohol from your own vineyard. So you just reinforce the character from the vineyard. This is what we are pushing for right now. And also that right now the mandatory level of alcohol is 15%, which I think is too high. I think we can easily make balanced wines with less. So more and more by twitching things and doing things, you must understand, if you do a very long aging like we do up at the Solera has an average age of 9 years. So the consummation, the yeast, they consume alcohol, they consume volatile acidity, which is great, and glycerol. So the wine is transformed, but especially that it consumes quite a lot of alcohol, of course, means that if you start with a wine that's 12% alcohol, you will end up with a wine that's 9. Also, that this consummation of alcohol is something that you have to take into consideration. So for the moment, we are adding alcohol, not the alcohol that we would like to add, but because we do such a long aging in the end, and we have a tremendous amount of least contact also. So we make the wine between the active living yeast layer on top of the wine and the dead yeast on the bottom. And both form a very important part of what's the character of the wine. So I often say that we make the wine between life and death. So we have the living layer on top and the dead layer on the bottom. And this is what actually makes a Pinot. So the idea, just to sum it up, is Vineyard designated pheno production. That's what we do.
Very, very cool. And just before we wrap up, I want to touch on where you're at right now. You're in Saint Emilion right now, and give us the overview there. Tell us a little bit about maybe also what sort of different approaches you might take back home in Spain versus here in Saint Emilion in the vineyard, and what maybe the distinct challenges could be.
Yeah, I think probably Saint Emilion has learned more from Spain than Spain is learning from Bordeaux right now. In the sense that the warming started. We're used to the warm weather in Spain. So once we had around 15, 16 harvests here in Saint Emilion, we were well prepared to combat. And we didn't go for extractions, and we much more infusion and low temperature fermentation, very little new. All these factors made that we were pretty early on already heading in what you can call today in especially 22, 23 vintages, the new style of Bordeaux, which is softer, much more aromatic, much better balance of the oakiness, cleaner also, less bread. Some tremendously interesting wines coming out of Bordeaux right now of the younger vintages. The challenge we have right now is we have a 24 that we had the double amount of rain that we ever had, 1,400 millimeters of rain. It was an enormous challenge. We also biodynamically certified here at Rousson. To fight out the mildew was a constant battle. That started very early on in March. We had an early bud break, and the mildew eggs were already ripe. So the first leaves that came out, they were just attacked immediately by mildew. So it's just been ongoing fight. I think we sprayed every single week until harvest. So it was just crazy. And with the amount of spray that we are allowed to use, and we can only use copper. So we had tremendously limited on what we can use. It was a real challenge. What was very, very interesting, and which I think is even encouraging in a way from a biodynamic point of view, is that we found out from experience with our neighbors also that for the first time, it wasn't what you sprayed with. It didn't really matter if it was biodynamic or it was conventional. What seemed to be the most important was the timing of the spraying when you sprayed, and the equipment that you used. The better the spraying material was, the finer the droplets were and stuff like that. Made a tremendous difference, much more than the actual product that you used. This is very, very, very interesting because it belies the fact that conventional is always better, no? When you have a big, but it's also true that it takes tremendous amount of work. You really have to be out there in the vineyard all the time. And you have to spray only a couple of hours after the last rain. Otherwise, you just lose it. If you wait too long, if you're away for a weekend, you come back on Monday and everything is gone. That's the experience. And some very, very famous properties in Bordeaux, they lost a great part of their harvest because they couldn't organize their work in a proper way, and they just couldn't spray at the right moment. So really a tough lesson.
That makes sense.
Very important, very, very important lesson too.
Yeah. So the finer spray so that it more thoroughly coated the leaf properly and all the green parts.
Yeah.
And then
Exactly.
Cool. And then spraying directly after rather than like before, because it'll get washed off in the rain, or it's like not prevented.
Exactly.
Interesting. That's really cool to hear the difference between the conventional and just the copper.
Yeah.
And what do you?
Conventional, they rely on systemic.
Yeah.
And think they just penetrate the leaves and then they are safe for the next 2 weeks, which is not true.
And then that helps you, if it's finer spray, stay under the limit. What is the amount of liters per hectare you guys have now? Is it like 6 or?
No. The thing is, we can use over 3 years. We can use 7 kilos of active copper per hectare.
Interesting. I forgot that it was
over
rolling.
3 years. Yeah. So it's rolling, and of course by using very, very little copper in each spray, but a lot of sprays all the time. You have to potentiate it with plant extracts. So a lot of silicates. So you help to make the leaves harder. So a lot of silicates, which is really interesting because the 2501 spray from the Steiner school, that's pure silicate. is actually really efficient also. But anything that can be willow and stuff like that also, that we do extracts of willow, is also really interesting. A lot of stuff is on that side too.
Can you talk a little bit about the wines that you make? Yeah, the tiers from this project, and then also, yeah, I guess we'll start with that.
As far as the wine, I become more and more. I was, for better words, I was lucky to taste the famous 82 vintage in barrel. I started working in 83 in Bordeaux, and I just happened to start around the en primeur season of when the 82 was presented in early 83 spring. And so that has marked me a lot. It was a very controversial vintage, being very ripe. Today it's ridiculous. It was very ripe. It was 13% alcohol. It was a huge vintage also. Often vineyards were producing 60 hectoliters per hectare. So a lot of what later on became the dogma of very low yields and ultra ripeness and all that, this vintage was so far from that. But what was great about the 82 was it was supremely balanced, and it just tasted really, really good from the barrel on. And so that has marked very much what I believe in. I really like aromatic wines. That's not just aromatic in a fruity scent, but really a lifted aromatic sensation. I like that in Bordeaux wines. I like that in Burgundy wines. I like that in Ribera wines. And a certain lightness to the touch, but lightness with intensity. It shouldn't just be diluted lightness. No, it should be something that has intense. But it all comes down to the quality of the tannins. So that balance that you find in that's what drives me nuts. And more and more when I taste wines is what it could be very old wines. I just did a tasting in northern Germany where we tasted some very old Bordeaux wines and some of the greatest wine from the 50s and 60s. And the best ones of them were the wines that had this lovely balance and sort of a airy feeling to it, and with a lot of aromatic intensity. That's what we're driving at. Balance.
Very cool.
To be. Yeah.
And that drives, like, it's for the tannins, you're reaching this ripeness maybe sooner in terms of sugar. How are you allowing the skins to create these maybe more developed tannins without getting too ripe?
There seems to be a school that sort of think that in order to get ripe tannins, you have to harvest very late. I'm not sure that's exactly true. I'd much rather harvest today much earlier and then adapt my vinification of much less extraction, lower temperature for the fermentation that also limits the extraction. The Tempranillo grape in Ribera is so intense and so ripe and has so much of everything that you should only try to seek the best of it. And you don't need to take everything with you from the grapes. That I think is a big lesson.
Awesome. Well, I think that basically that's a good way to wrap up here. Is there anything looking forward that we should keep a lookout for? Are you going to be any new wines going to be released? I guess the new Garnacha.
I think, yeah, in that sense, and it's that we haven't taken 100% the decision yet when it's going to be, but probably stuff could start happening from in the next couple of years. You'll see some stuff coming out from new stuff that we're going to do. I mean, I do realize I do making projects, but they must be worthwhile. Just to take out a new wine just for taking it out, I don't believe in that. There must be something really interesting about it. Otherwise, there are far too many wines in the world today, and just really try to make something that's really worthwhile. Otherwise, don't bother people with it.
Awesome.
That's my approach.
That's amazing. Well, Peter, thank you so much for the time. We really appreciate you joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me. That was great.
All right. That was our interview with Peter Sisseck. I hope everybody learned a ton about Spanish wines, Pingus, old vines, and just viticulture in general. I could have talked to him for hours, so I hope everybody found it as fascinating as I did. if you're interested in purchasing any Florida Pingus or Pingus, just check out the Vint Marketplace website. We have plenty of vintages of his wines, and we are excited to have more, hopefully more PSI in the future of that Garnacha he's talking about. But for now, that is our episode for this week, and we'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.